Good morning. So, no matter whether you're here in person or whether you're watching online, or where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. I think I got that all out of line. You know to turn off your... This is not me saying this. This is Jesus saying. Turn your phone off or give it to him.
I have a confession about that.
What?
My husband is the only person who can break through the do not disturb, and he keeps sending me youth basketball updates. Youth basketball updates.
Do you not have your phone on do not disturb?
I have it on do not disturb, but he's the only person who can break through because he's my emergency.
You can set it where that's possible.
He's my emergency contact.
And that takes precedence over...
Jesus.
Oh, we're in for a ride today.
Yeah. So if I bust out 5239, that's what's going on. Yeah. My youngest. Yeah. Yeah, we'll do what we can. If I'm like, yes, then I just...
Well, except for basketball scores, we're going to have a period of silence. So we use this time to call to mind our intention to be aware that we right now exist in the heart of sacred mystery, and that this mystery seeks to find expression through who we are and how we live. And we ask that grace would be in our heads and in our thinking, grace be in our eyes and in our seeing, grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in the mouths of Holly and me today as we speak. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And give us the freedom and the willingness and the courage to relinquish any thoughts or forms of life that keep flourishing from happening on this planet. And may what we do here today benefit all people everywhere. Amen.
Amen.
So we have just completed a time of really in-depth look at the Lord's Prayer and probably communicating some things, according to some of you, that you've never heard before. And part of that is because of the new research that's been done in biblical and archaeological studies that have never made it to a place like this. So what I want to say today is that whatever else prayer is, and we'll kind of return to this next week, is that prayer is not made to a God who is off out there somewhere, and we are asking this God to come and fix things. Spiritual practice, of which prayer can be a part, is a process of growing in alignment and awareness and transformation. That is to say, it's not about changing God, but rather it is about changing the one who prays. So one way of summing up what the preceding teachings about the Lord's Prayer have been is that the goal has been to enable us to more fully enter and participate in life, to heighten our consciousness, and to empower us to become more open to love, to justice, and personal responsibility. The three key words that we keep returning to again and again are humility, justice, and peace. And you're going to hear those over and over. Because the purpose of this is so that we can experience the transformation that enables us to act differently in the world. So, following the narrative and the teaching of the life and teachings of Jesus is laid out by Stephen Mitchell. The teaching that immediately follows the Lord's Prayer in his narrative is this. The eye of the lamp, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is clear, your whole body is luminous. But if your eye isn't clear, your whole body is dark. And if the light in you is darkness, there's a paradox. If the light in you is darkness, how great that darkness is.
Another paradox.
Huh?
How great that darkness is also
Yeah.
a bit of a paradox. No.
So I try to work it that Holly, for those of you who don't know and don't pay homage to her, Dr. Holly Hudley, that we teach here about once a month, and there are multitudes of reasons for this. For one thing, it helps me out enormously. On my gratitude list every day for the last several days, I think the first thing I've written is, I'm so grateful Holly's teaching with me this Sunday.
That's sweet.
So it helps me out, and it helps you too, because you get to hear another voice, a different perspective, and particularly about today, because darkness is a feminine quality, right? You think that? So you get and besides, it's just fun for us. Holly has to put up with
It's good.
my jokes.
Mm-hmm. Well, everybody does. That it's not. Yeah.
But the one that got her this week was that if April showers bring Mayflowers, what do Mayflowers bring?
I said June bugs.
Pilgrims.
He said pilgrims. I thought June bugs was a good one.
So one of the things that we
Yeah. Colonizers.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, my wife's frequent response is just don't encourage him. So when it came to our studying this week's text, which we're using as a grounding and starting point for what we want to teach, I discovered that I wanted to teach about the fear of the light. And Holly said, when I said that, she said, oh, that's great because I want to teach about the fear of the dark. And the social application of that, how we deal with it and all that sort of stuff, which is really ironic because it was the fear of the dark that got me started in my interest in psychology and eventually theology in the first place. So here we go.
There's a million different directions I wanted to take this week. Immediately when thinking about the eyeball, I was nerding out about the evolution of the eyeball that evolved from a water-based speck on top of an amoeba that could detect light and was drawn to the surface because of that detection. And our eyeball is based on that same principle. It's a water-based eyeball. And now we're capable of seeing something like 1 million to 10 million colors.
Women can.
Women can see 10 million, men can see 1 million. Then I started thinking about the eyeball kind of more symbolically, like Meister Eckhart says, which is the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And then another favorite, Teilhard de Chardin, philosopher and theologian, who says seeing, one could say that the whole of life lies in seeing, if not ultimately, at least essentially. To be more is to be more united, and as unity grows, only if it is supported by an increase of consciousness or of vision. So unity is increased the more we learn to see. He's not talking about the literal eyeball. He's talking about or how we let light in. He's talking about how we see with the heart, including how we see in times of darkness. I also thought about The Little Prince. Y'all, you have to forgive my Texas accent. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I've never pronounced that correctly, but I love this book. The Little Prince wrote or says, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." I think this is really kind of the crux of what we're getting at today, is how do we learn to see, not with certainty, but with curiosity, love, and openness. So there's 3 points that I thought about this week that I hope to get across. One is, the dark is neither an enemy nor something to fear. Knowing it, becoming friends with it, is necessary to get to the place where your eye is clear and your whole body is luminous. Second, the way through the dark is both curious and creative, which are quintessentially feminine qualities. And then third, the danger of certainty, and how certainty keeps us mired in darkness, and how I really want to differentiate between certainty and conviction, how those two are different. So we're starting as a conversation about light and dark, how value judgments of both of these have misguided us. Without one, we miss the significance of the other, and we're maybe ending with a conversation about the paradox of tolerance, how bypassing our darkness or staying too comfortable in it actually allows for intolerance to be tolerated, which is kind of where we are right now. You're up.
What's the score?
I don't know, but my son just scored. I did see that text. He's a bit he's really timid sometimes. So we're always rooting for him.
Tell us a story about the free throw.
Oh my God, y'all. Anyone watching NBA basketball right now? Do you know that only 2% of the time in any level of basketball, college, March Madness, NBA, the shots that they make at the end of the game to buzzer beater beneath half court, that's 2% of the time those are made. And last weekend's tournament that my son played in, they were losing by 1. They inbound the ball at the opposite end of the court. One kid inbounds it to another. They pass it back. He passes it back to the second kid. He just takes his whole body and made the bucket. And they won by 2. It literally is the sports highlight of the year. It was amazing. I have the video. I wish I brought it. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're teaching except for that when I needed a little cheering up this week, I was like, let me just watch that highlight.
It has to do with joy and exuberance.
Absolutely.
And celebration.
And it belongs to a 14-year-old kid,
yeah.
Which is just so cute. So
a breakthrough.
Yeah.
So, as I said, it's ironic that we've swapped roles in terms of what our focus is for today. Because I really was, as a child, inordinately frightened of the dark. And particularly at nighttime when it was time to go to sleep, to be by myself was just terrifying. And I knew that other kids weren't, and I wanted to know what they knew that I didn't know. And I started reading books on peace of mind when I was in junior high. And again, I've said this before, but I was reading books in high school that if my kids had been reading, I would have said, there's something wrong with this picture. Because I was reading Paul Tillich when I was in high school. And there's nothing normal about that. So what I want to do in this block today is try to answer some questions that grew out of the teaching about the Lord's Prayer, about why people are frightened of new insights in theological and biblical studies. So there have just been whirls of amazement and wonder that have occurred in the last decades that have not made it into the education program of Catholic and Protestant churches. So I want to give you a very brief overview of how that happened, particularly with regards to the Bible, because somebody said to me after last week, you made the comment that we are people with a book, not people of the book. I thought that was a core principle of Protestantism. Yes? No. So let's talk about how do we get in the position of giving almost an idolatrous status to the Bible. the religious education I had as a child, I was Southern Baptist, went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday, and every other time the church was open. And we were taught to learn and memorize passages from the Bible. In Sunday school, if you could stand up and recite the 23rd Psalm by memory, you were given a little plastic bookmark to put in your Bible. We were graded on whether we read the Bible every day. There was a grading system that you checked in Sunday school. I did my daily Bible readings, and we memorized passages. The Southern Baptists had a program for young people called Sword Drill. Sword drill, because the Bible is a sword. And we would stand in front of the class with the Bible in our hands like this. Somebody would say a passage of Scripture, Psalm 119, verse 18. Draw swords, put your Bible like this, hands on top and bottom, no cheating with thumbs on the edge, and then go. And whoever could find that verse fast was going to heaven. So one of the verses that I learned as a child was, your word is a lamp for my feet and a light for my path. We're talking about light today and dark. And I was taught that that verse applied to the Bible. Now think about that. It's from the Psalms. There was no Bible when that was written. That verse was actually written probably 1,000 years before there was a Bible. But I was taught that verse referred to the Bible. And the people who taught me that knew no better. They weren't stupid, but they were ignorant of how the Bible came to be. And because that was the community that I trusted, I believe that to be the case. So how do we get here? At the time of Jesus, of course, there was no Bible. There were the Jewish scriptures called the Law and the Prophets, which were read in the synagogue, and there were the Psalms, but they hadn't been compiled in a book because books didn't exist. They were on scrolls, and for at least the first 2 generations of Jesus' followers, they were Jews who put together the narratives of Jesus based on their Jewish eyes and their Jewish way of seeing. So a split occurred. Is this catching me up? I can't see.
Yeah.
A split occurred in this Jewish community about the year 90. At that time, the Jesus followers who were still worshiping in the synagogue and were arguing in favor of Jesus being the anointed one got extruded from the synagogue by more stringent Jews. And out of that grew the Gospel of John, which is a beautiful gospel. It's lyrical, it's mystical, but its primary reason for existence was as a polemic against the Jews that had pushed these people out. So when you read about in John the Jews playing a role in the crucifixion of Jesus, that's the Jewish population that they're talking about, because the document was written by a Jew. So there was a split in Jews at the time that the Gospel of John was written. Almost every word, now listen to this carefully because I don't want to offend anybody. Almost every word of the parable that was created about the crucifixion. I didn't say the crucifixion didn't happen. I'm saying that the way it was told was a parable constructed by Jews, and almost every word of the crucifixion story is taken from Jewish literature, mostly from Psalms and mostly from the book of Isaiah. These were not reporters that were standing around writing things that happened. They went back and constructed a story. Another break happened when Paul started taking the message of Jesus to a non-Jewish population. And this is where you have the switch to Greek. Paul's writings are the first that we have in what we call the collection of the New Testament, not the Gospels. The letters of Paul were written to specific groups of people. They were not written about us. Paul did not have us in mind when he was writing these letters. He was writing to solve a problem and to get money, because that's what he needed to survive. So centuries passed, and there was no Bible, there were no anything. The first four Gospels were chosen because of the great logic that there were four winds and four directions of the earth, so we need four Gospels. And the ones that didn't fit were destroyed for the most part. Some of that is recently, over the last number of decades, some of those other writings have come into view. But at the time, Christians didn't have them. There were no books. There were no Bibles. So fast forward to Copernicus. Oh my. There's this insight that the earth is not the center of the universe. And this upsets everything about Christian theology. So there's a big division. As you know, the Catholic Church at that time, there was no Protestant church. They had a discussion about this and said, well, we're just going to keep it like it has been. Ignore science and keep the Bible. Keep the scripture. Again, there was no Bible at this time. So at that time, the Bible stopped being studied or read through Jewish eyes. And there was a debate about how we can handle things. And because this new science brought up more questions than the church could answer. By the way, the Roman Catholic Church did not recant its position on Copernicus until about 300 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And where they forgave Galileo also.
And they forgave Galileo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the fruits of biblical scholarship were kept out of parish life and retained for the church, for the scholars. And then there was this big split that occurred at the Protestant Reformation. And the word Protestant, of course, comes from the word protest. So there were people who protested some things about the church in Rome, what they were doing about selling indulgences, and there was this split. And at that time, in order to ensure the church's authority, a dogma was passed that said that the Pope, the head of the church, was infallible. Well, the Protestants, they weren't going to take that, so they said, well, the Pope is infallible, then the Bible is infallible. But again, there wasn't a Bible except available to very few people. And then this big thing happened with a guy named Gutenberg. And he did a printing of the Bible, which made it more accessible to a few people. And then in 1611, being translated from the Greek into the Latin into English, we have the King James Version of the Bible. And that was the first time the Bible became available to the general public. For up until then, most people didn't have a Bible. This is where stained glass came from. Mm-hmm. Stained glass windows were put in churches to tell stories because people couldn't read and they didn't have Bibles. And so the Protestants became masters at splitting. Splitting. I think there's something like 127 different kinds of Baptists. Mm-hmm. in the United States. And you know the recent split among the Presbyterians and among the Methodists, and we just divide, we just split over things in the Bible that were not written for us. Now, I don't want to be operated on by somebody who's just visited an article on ChatGPT. And I don't want the Bible interpreted for me by somebody who doesn't know about the biblical history and various ways to interpret it. However, what I was taught was that anybody is able to interpret the Bible on their own, and that's risky. So the Bible, the writings in the Bible are meant to point beyond themselves. And if we are in the Christian tradition, our authority is Jesus. Not the Bible. And I think that the integrity of love is more important than the purity of doctrine.
I wonder if we're not saying such different things because new light or new understanding emerges from darkness, from grappling. This is true both cosmologically, evolutionarily, and metaphorically. In the, keep going past yours, first chapter of Genesis, it's written that God spoke light and light appeared. God saw that the light was good and separated light from dark. In day one. I think of this as the singularity, kind of the moment of the Big Bang, which is much more than a moment. It's actually still ongoing. It's still evolving. The Big Bang enabled stars to form, which brought forth the creation of complex elements like carbon and phosphorus and every other element that's on our table. All of those ultimately formed planets and the creatures that inhabit them. I love this fact that the carbon in our bones is from those first stars that were created. So we have ancient stuff in our bodies. And this is what carbon looks like. It's dark and dense and opaque. It's the stuff we're made of. We too are a constant beginning and process, being formed and reformed and formed again by this delicate dance of light and dark. Nowhere from day one do we read that the light was good and therefore the dark was bad. It just says, God liked the light. It was good. In fact, the light needed the dark in order to make itself known. One needs the other. Christina Koch, one of the Artemis II astronauts, her greatest sort of wow moment of being on the space shuttle was the darkness of what surrounded her, how absolutely fundamentally dark it was. And she called Earth from afar a lifeboat hanging undisturbingly in the universe. So how, if darkness is holding us in balance, did it become associated with something to fear? Here are some possibilities. Number one, fear of the dark is evolutionary. It is an ancient survival mechanism. Dating back approximately 1 million years, it's a trait that evolved to protect early humans from nocturnal predators. We go in at night so we don't get eaten. Our anxiety about the dark then kept us close to the fire when Prometheus gave us fire, out of the path of danger and more likely to stay alive and therefore reproduce. Number two, fear of the dark is cultural. From time immemorial, since we started creating stories, they focused on distinction between good and evil. The dark, often associated with mystery, therefore got assigned evil, fear, death, danger. Myths and stories further define human societies and religions through repetition. And some of these symbols or stories harden into truth or dogma. So they moved from subjective interpretation to fixed dogmas. This happens because the original creative, poetic, or illusory nature of a phrase or symbol is forgotten. It hardens. Truth is light, is a metaphor that's accepted as a literal truth. A description of how truth illuminates, clarifies, and removes darkness. Being in the dark about something signifies our ignorance or not knowing. It signifies uncertainty and confusion. In psychology, we talk about battling the shadow. So we create this rigid belief that emotional healing is fundamentally a fight against darkness, rather than a process of befriending it. Fear of the dark is also developmental. As Bill said, as a kid, he was terrified of the dark, and a child's imagination is extraordinarily alive. You might remember this, or you have grandchildren or children between the ages of 3 and 6. Things become a little less concrete and more enveloped by the imagination. She lacks the ability to distinguish between what is real and what is fantasy. I really believed that I could talk to animals and they could talk back to me. Who knows, maybe I really could, and I lost that. But I believed that as a kid. I don't know about y'all, but I used to lie in my bed at night. And if you grew up in Houston, you know that no matter where you live, rich, poor, somewhere in between, you have cockroaches. And I was terrified that if I got out of my bed at night, that I would be enveloped by cockroaches. So I would lay in my bed, snuggled up into my covers, and I would make up stories about the shadows on the walls. And I imagined that my closet was full of cockroaches. I never got out of my bed to go to the bathroom or anything for fear of sending them scurrying. I have outgrown my fear of the dark. I have not outgrown my fear of cockroaches. They make me scream like a small child. I would also venture to say that our associations with light and dark fed our disordered thinking about racial hierarchies. If we assigned black or dark as evil and white as good or pure, rigid beliefs. They became rigid beliefs. I don't want to oversimplify because there's so much more emotional content to this, but this kind of thinking is what happens when metaphors become dogma. We create and sustain absurd truths. An author that we've all heard, Barbara Brown Taylor, has a book called, I believe it's called Dancing in the Dark or Walking in the Dark. Now I can't remember. I'm reading it. Do you remember? Walking. She does a study of the dark based on the lunar calendar. And so far it's very poetic and very personal and very narrative. She writes, as universal as darkness may be, our experience of it is local. It is also social, cultural, economic, and political.
So I'm thinking, based on what you said, that I'm not very evolved. I think that could be true. You know, I'm still scared of the dark in a lot of ways.
I'm still afraid of cockroaches.
Okay, so if Jesus is the way that we are to be guided, then you can see how, beginning in the 18th, 19th century, and all this happened in Europe, not in the United States. That's a whole other story about why. You can see why biblical scholars begin to say, well, if Jesus is to be the authority for those who are Christians, how do we know who Jesus was and how do we know what Jesus said? And so a guy by the name of Strauss in the 19th century started this first quest for the historical Jesus. And it's continued. There have been like 3 major quests for the historical Jesus. Strauss was one. Not Schweitzer.
That's right.
Was it Schweitzer?
Yeah.
Was one, and Robert Funk was one. So we've had 3 over the last number of years. It's a whole debate that we can talk about at some point, and I have talked about in the past, but what was it that Jesus said? Oh, come on, folks.
Love your neighbor.
You love your neighbor. That was what he said. Somebody went to Jesus and said, hey, guy, what are we to believe? And he, being a Jew, didn't have doctrines. Jews had commands. They had laws. The law and the prophets. Jesus was a Jew, not a Methodist. I thought he was a Baptist, but that's another thing. So Jesus said, the law says you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and you're to love your neighbor by yourself, as yourself. And we've been debating about who the neighbor is ever since he said it, anyway. So Jesus wanted people of his time, his Jewish brothers and sisters, to see things differently. And he did this primarily by what he did, and then by commenting on what he did. He wanted people to see things differently. And what set Jesus apart from other spiritual teachers is that he empowered those who heard him to do the same thing that he was doing. He wanted other people to help other people to see things differently. So his vision was to bring about a new world order, and that new order would be like what the world would look like if God ran the show. And we've been talking about that for weeks in here. The world would look like a well-run house. A well-run house is one where everybody's in good shape and everybody's taken care of. Now, the church of my youth, Southern Baptist, which is a denomination that is, as far as I know, the only existing one in the United States that has a geographical name attached to its identity. It started because of
enslavement.
The race, the whole division of race. I was raised in deeply Jim Crow kind of country. So when my church heard that Jesus wanted people to do what he was doing, the way they interpreted that was, we need to go get people to join our church. And we also need to send people to other countries to get them to believe like we believe. And that became the beginning of what we call foreign missions, that we would send people overseas to save people's souls. The biggest thing you could do as a kid in my growing up was to walk down to the front of the church, rededicate your life to Christ, and say that what you wanted to do was be a medical missionary in Africa. Then maybe I wouldn't feel so guilty about other stuff I was doing. But what Jesus taught, I'm going to get to this, what Jesus taught is that we welcome the vulnerable, the disabled, the children. We speak the truth. We practice generosity, and that we live out of step with the world. Be not conformed. That we love those our culture teaches us to call our enemies. By the way, the Talmud says that the true hero is one who makes an enemy a friend. And the other thing I would point out is that that Jesus did his work with and to people who were resident aliens. They were aliens in the geographical area where they lived because another country had political power. Okay. And Jesus called them to follow him in a time of an authoritarian regime. You can apply some of this for yourself. Mm-hmm. So being a Christian then is not a matter of what you believe. It's a way of following what Jesus lived to the best of our ability, which, if that is true, may make me one of the worst Christians you've ever known. I don't know. You have to put yourself in that category, how you fit about that. It is my faith and my hope that if we inhabit these teachings, we're given a life that is capable of weathering any storm. and we are in stormy times. Our Supreme Court has just gutted the Voting Rights Act. And we are, as a country, spending taxpayer dollars at the rate of $2 billion a day on this war that is not a war, that is a war that's over or not over. It's crazy. And we could have used that money to fund child care, health care, free college education for people who couldn't afford it. And at the same time, the message of our government is we can't afford to do those things. My point is that our country does not represent or reflect a well-run household at any level. Now, some of this may shock you, but what Jesus taught shocked people. But his teachings have become so familiar to us that, yeah, we know that. So we've gotten to the point where we think that coming to church and learning about Jesus is intended to make us be better people. And no doubt, there are some of us who could use that. But primarily, the teachings of Jesus are intended to cause us to see differently. To see ourselves, to see each other, to see others differently. And they're to help us to see something so new, so against what we are hearing in our cultural message, that we can no longer rely on our older images of what is and what is not. Mm-hmm. So we have to enter the light to see what is. Mm. My very first spiritual director said, half of all relational problems that exist on the planet are existing because of an inability or an unwillingness to see what is and what isn't. Mm-hmm. The way he put it is, what is, and what ain't. Mm-hmm. And we have to see what is instead of denying and living in the dark.
Well, I think we have to engage with the dark, and that's the point I'm making, is that our if we bypass the dark, we won't sort of receive or enter into new light. And one of my favorite ways to sort of play with the dark is through dream work. I still can recall vividly dreams from my childhood. I don't know why, but most nights still I look forward to sleep because these images come unbidden to me, and I could not write a Stranger movie script. But they teach me something about my fears, my anxieties, projections, hopes, old things that I can transform into new things. So when we don't learn to see in the dark, we become blind to the fact that we're even in it. I don't know if any of you saw this new Banksy statue that's been unveiled, where he's walking kind of blinded by a flag over his face, stepping off of an edge. When we're in the dark, we don't realize it. It's written that before God separated light from dark, God created the heavens and the earth. All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. One of my favorite theologians, I've mentioned her many times in here, Catherine Keller, points to this opening line again and again and again as proof that the Judeo-Christian tradition is rooted in a theology of darkness, and that darkness is rooted in the feminine. It was not something to fear. It is our essence, as I said before, our birthright from which everything came. And when we repress this energy, as Christianity is wont to do, we get patriarchal interpretations of creation that prioritize order and power over relationality. So order and power crave certainty, relationality craves flexibility and curiosity. The Hebrew word for abyss, for that deep, that's written about in the very first line of Scripture as we know it, is tihom. And tihom is a feminine noun that also means deep, primeval ocean. It appears 36 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's related to the Babylonian chaos goddess Tiamat. She is a fluid force, but you upset her, and chaos reigns. When we deny her, this is where we sink into further darkness. And that same word, tihom, appears in Jonas's story, in which he's trapped in the belly of a whale in a period of extreme darkness. He returns to that deep, that primordial space to undergo a transformation. So again, we see through these metaphors that dark is necessary to obtain new light. He's then spit up onto the shore with new understandings. So next time you get trapped in the sensation of the dark as hopeless and full of suffering, which inevitably will happen, perhaps we can remember that it's just a temporary hijacking of the imagination. If you approach it with curiosity, our imagination invites us to sit with it in a whole new way. The practice of creating as an artist, someone who is trained as an artist and still practices art, the process of creating is like something coming from nothing, right? So it's new light coming from darkness. It's a form, it's one of our most ancient forms of crying out in that proverbial darkness. What do we have that is more ancient than words in humanity? We have images. And those images have taught us about how we have danced in the dark in some ways. So creativity requires curiosity, and these two are our field guides for engaging with the dark.
So one time somebody asked Richard Rohr something about, well, if you had to sum up what the story of Jesus is about and what its legacy is for us, what you would say. And he said, I will say to you what he said. The only thing that will be given to you is the sign of Jonah. Which we should explore sometime.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
it's
story.
a great parable about yes and no and who's in and who's out and I need to be in control and all that. So the teachings of and about the wayless way are hard. They are not hard to understand. They are not hard to comprehend. They're just hard. And I can attest to the fact that institutions, because I have been in them long enough to know, want to soften that message, because if we make them too hard, we're going to offend people who've got money to help keep the institution going. And that's the rub for any institution, particularly a religious one. And you have to wonder, you know, where is the line? Where do you cross the line? I had a good friend who was a head minister of a church in Jacksonville, Florida, and the Sunday after Martin Luther King was assassinated, he crossed the line, said something about it from his pulpit. He was fired the next day. Where's the line? What would he take? Where's the line where we draw saying, no more, you can't? We have to speak against that. So from Jesus on, and this I think is true in every living tradition, the way that is taught is the way of descent, the way of letting go. Jesus said, unless you are willing to let go everything, you can't follow. Now, we've always said that meant money. But I want to offer you that it has to do with the way we think, with what we believe, letting go of long-held beliefs, even if they are no longer serviceable. Major piece of evidence for this is that everybody in this room today, everybody in every Protestant and Catholic church that's meeting in the United States today survives on a post-Copernican worldview. We embrace science. We want it to be the latest and the best. And yet we go into worship services and recite creeds and prayers that were written from a pre-Copernican worldview. And we do it every Sunday. And so what that leads to is people either believing what is not believable, not seeing it, or shutting their eyes, gritting their teeth, and working through it. Change is hard. Change is hard. The primary teaching of Jesus was about full inclusion. That's what attracted people into the movement. There was no discrimination between or among people. As a matter of fact, the first elaborate statement, creedal statement of the church was, in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, in him no north or south, you know that hymn. It didn't stay that way, particularly right up to and after 325. That all changed. It's ironic to me that right now the ones leading the charge on divisiveness in this culture claim to be following Jesus. They call their movement Christian. They want to make it national. So how do you tell people that what they have believed about the origin of the church, the Bible, Jesus, what it means to be Christian, is not what was ever taught or believed or intended by Jesus? By the way, the reason we have an uprising of people on the right is that they thought they were included by people who are more affluent and who make the rules. So it's a hard teaching, but the only security that comes to us in life comes from embracing insecurity. Following the wayless way, far from diminishing risk, inspires, hopefully, the courage to take them on, including the risk of intellectual uncertainty.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons we're in sort of a space of darkness is because we're clinging to some certainty. We get confused about freedom. And especially progressives actually think that more freedom means that we have to be more tolerant, and even of intolerable things. I just encountered this philosopher, Karl Popper, who was a staunch defender of liberal democracy and against totalitarianism. He was born to Austrian Jewish parents and escaped Nazi Germany in 1937 and remained openly critical of it. He said that a tolerant society is the bare minimum of a pluralistic democracy. And we have to be prepared to restrict intolerance if we are going to uphold freedom. He says we should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or kidnapping or the revival of the slave trade as criminal. Disagreement's not the issue here. We can disagree. It's when disagreement goes toward denial of one's humanity, freedoms, rights to exist. The recent gutting of the Voting Rights Act exemplifies how little we regard non-white, non-male, non-wealthy participation in what we call a liberal democracy. Surely we see that freedom and justice has not and does not apply to all. But based on the scholarship that I trust about the Jesus narrative, he would not have tolerated such intolerance. If we claim him as teacher, I think we are compelled to ask ourselves, do we? This is where I think we need to discern between conviction and certainty, my final point. Jesus' convictions followed the path of justice, humility, and love, and if we see it through the lens of Christian theology, conviction is a divine prompting of the conscience that helps us deal with our shadow. It's a firm stance. It's based on shared purpose and goals and allows us to have rational discussion and ultimately transform societies. And to contrast, certainty is also firm, but it's inflexible. It breaks down or lashes out when challenged, whereas conviction inspires. Certainty is exclusive, conviction is expansive. Conviction is the way of the universe, it's the way of Jesus, it's the way of love and belonging and community. I'll end with a very brief story about a man walking down the street. And as he walked down the street, he fell into a hole. The walls of the hole were so steep he couldn't climb out. So the man sat in the dark hole and cried out for help. Soon a doctor walked by and he heard the man's cries, and the doctor wrote a prescription, tossed it down into the hole, and walked away. Before long, a priest walks by and heard the man. He says, "Father, can you help me?" The priest writes a prayer, throws it down in the hole, and walks away. Finally, a friend comes along and he says, "Friend, can you help me?" And the friend jumps into the hole with him. The man who had been trapped is like, "What are you doing? Now we're both stuck in the hole." And the friend says, "Yes, but I know the way out. I've been down here before."
Good story. I got one.
You do?
Well, yeah, it's a Zen story, Zen teaching story I love, about the guy who was out hunting for food for his family, and he looked and saw a Bengal tiger chasing him. And he started running and running, and the brambles hit him and got his legs and everything. And he looked back to see where the Bengal tiger was, and he, not noticing, he went over the edge of a cliff, but he grabbed a tree root on the way down and held it. And he screamed for help. "Help me, help me." And there was this voice that came from above saying, "Let go, son, I will catch you." And he looked around, he didn't see anybody. And he said, "Who is that?" And the voice said, "It is I, son, it is God. Let go, I will catch you." The guy looked around, he didn't see anybody. And he said, "Is there anybody else up there?" That's not the way the story goes. The story goes that he was in this predicament. And while he couldn't go up and he couldn't let go, what he noticed when he looked aside was a strawberry. And he reached out and grabbed it and relished it. So how do we in perilous times learn to do that? So after this teaching, the next several teachings in the Jesus narrative are about how to accomplish this very thing. I want to close with some words that I got from William Sloane Coffin, who at one time was a preacher at Riverside Church. And this is written shortly after his son, who was in his 20s, was accidentally killed in a car wreck. Coffin wrote, "God, keep us eager to pursue truth, scornful of the cowardice that does not face new truth, the laziness content with half-truth, and the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth. Keep us on the stony, long, lonely road that leads to peace." So no matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo. So watch your step, and see you here next week.